My name is Rebecca, and at 31 years old, I discovered that according to the Internal Revenue Service, I was a multimillionaire who had been evading taxes for 2 decades. The problem? I had never made more than $45,000 in a single year, and every penny I earned was meticulously reported. The bigger problem? The person who had been using my social security number to build this phantom fortune was someone I trusted completely. My own aunt, the woman who helped raise me after my mother died. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that the aunt who taught me to braid my hair and helped me with homework would systematically destroy my financial identity for her own gain. What started as mysterious credit denials would unravel into a web of deceit that reached back to when I was just 11 years old, revealing how the person closest to me had been quietly stealing my future one fraudulent transaction at a time. Growing up in the small coastal town of Ferndale, Oregon, I lived with my father Marcus in a modest 2-bedroom house that smelled perpetually of the cedar shavings from his carpentry workshop. My mother Elena had passed away from cancer when I was 10, leaving behind a grief-stricken husband and a daughter who suddenly felt lost in a world that had become too complicated too quickly. The months following her death were a blur of casseroles from neighbors, hushed conversations between adults, and the constant ache of missing someone who would never come back. It was during this difficult period that my father's sister Catherine stepped in to help. Aunt Cathy, as I called her, lived just 20 minutes away in the larger town of Brookfield, where she worked as an administrative assistant at a medical billing company. She was everything my father wasn't during those dark months: organized, energetic, and seemingly unaffected by the overwhelming sadness that had settled over our house like fog from the nearby Pacific. Aunt Cathy began spending more and more time at our house, arriving after school to help me with homework, staying for dinner, and often not leaving until after I was tucked into bed. She picked up the maternal responsibilities that my father, drowning in his own grief, couldn't manage. She braided my hair for school pictures, helped me shop for my first bra when I was too embarrassed to ask my father, and listened to my middle school drama with the patience of someone who genuinely cared. My father seemed relieved to have her support. Marcus had always been a quiet man who expressed love through actions rather than words, building me a treehouse, fixing my bike, teaching me to use his tools. But the emotional labor of raising a grieving preteen daughter overwhelmed him. When Aunt Cathy offered to handle things like school enrollment, doctor appointments, and other administrative tasks, he gratefully accepted her help. This arrangement worked well for everyone, or so it seemed. I gained a stable female presence in my life. My father could focus on his work and gradual healing, and Aunt Cathy appeared to find purpose in caring for her motherless niece. She had never married or had children of her own, often joking that she was too set in her ways for romance, but perfect for being the fun aunt who spoiled me just enough. What I didn't understand then was how much access this arrangement gave her to my personal information. As the person handling my school enrollment, medical appointments, and other official business, Aunt Cathy had legitimate reasons to know my social security number, date of birth, and other identifying details. She helped my father organize important documents after my mother's death, creating filing systems and handling correspondence with insurance companies and government agencies. Looking back, I can see how she positioned herself as the family's unofficial administrator, the person who handled all the paperwork and bureaucratic details that my father found tedious. She was so helpful, so organized, so willing to take care of things, that nobody questioned her involvement in our financial and legal affairs. She became indispensable, which was exactly what she wanted. The first few years after my mother's death passed quietly. I adjusted to life without her, though holidays and birthdays remained difficult. My father slowly emerged from his deepest grief and began engaging more actively in my daily life. Aunt Cathy's visits became less frequent but remained regular, usually involving weekend trips to the mall or helping me with school projects that required a woman's touch. During my freshman year of high school, Aunt Cathy suggested that I might want to start building credit early by becoming an authorized user on one of her credit cards. She explained that this would help me when I eventually needed to apply for student loans or rent an apartment. My father thought this was a generous and forward-thinking gesture, praising his sister for looking out for my future financial well-being. The process seemed simple enough. Aunt Cathy said she would add me to her account and I would receive a card with my name on it, but she would maintain control over the account to ensure I didn't make any mistakes that could damage my credit history. I would learn responsible spending habits by occasionally using the card for small purchases, which she would pay off immediately to build a positive payment history. I remember feeling very adult and responsible when the credit card arrived in the mail. It was a sleek silver card with my name embossed across the bottom, Rebecca Marie Hoffman. Seeing my name on that card made me feel like I was taking an important step toward independence, even though I was only 15 and had no real understanding of how credit actually worked. What I didn't realize was that this authorized user arrangement was just the beginning of something much more extensive. Aunt Cathy had used my personal information to open the account, but it wasn't a simple authorized user situation as she had described. She had actually opened a credit card in my name, using her address as the billing location and forging my signature on the application. The card was the first step in what would become a sophisticated identity theft operation that would span nearly 2 decades. But at 15, all I knew was that my aunt was helping me build credit and preparing me for financial independence. I trusted her completely, never questioning why the statements never came to our house, or why she never showed me how much we were spending. Throughout high school, I focused on my studies and worked part-time at a local bookstore to save money for college. My grades were solid, though not exceptional, and I planned to attend Oregon State University to study elementary education. Teaching had always appealed to me, perhaps because I remembered my favorite teachers during the difficult period after my mother's death, and wanted to provide that same stability and support to other children. My father's carpentry business had recovered well from the economic difficulties following my mother's medical bills, and he was able to set aside modest amounts for my college education. Combined with my savings from the bookstore and the financial aid I expected to receive, college seemed financially manageable. I applied for student loans and grants, confident that my clean financial record would work in my favor. The first sign that something was wrong came during my senior year when I was denied for a student credit card that was supposedly designed for people with no credit history. The rejection letter mentioned insufficient credit history, which confused me since Aunt Cathy had been helping me build credit for over 2 years. When I mentioned this to her, she dismissed it as a mistake by the credit card company and assured me that my credit was fine. A few months later, I was approved for student loans, but at a higher interest rate than I had expected. The financial aid officer mentioned that my credit report showed some activity that wasn't necessarily negative but suggested I.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Should monitor my credit more closely. Again, when I brought this up with Aunt Cathy, she explained that credit reports were often confusing and contained information that didn't necessarily reflect problems. These early warning signs were subtle enough that I didn't pursue them aggressively. I was 18, busy with graduation preparations and college planning, and I trusted Aunt Cathy's explanations. She had been helping me navigate financial matters for years, and I had no reason to doubt her expertise or motives. The idea that she might be using my identity for her own purposes never crossed my mind. College at Oregon State went smoothly for the most part. I lived in the dorms my freshman year, then moved to a shared apartment with 3 roommates for the remainder of my undergraduate studies. My father helped with expenses when he could, I worked part-time jobs throughout college, and my student loans covered the rest. I maintained a respectable GPA while majoring in elementary education and felt optimistic about my future career prospects. During my junior year, I applied for a credit card to help with textbook expenses and unexpected costs. I was denied, which surprised me since I had been building credit since high school and had never missed a student loan payment. The rejection letter cited too many recent credit inquiries and high debt-to-income ratio, neither of which made sense based on my actual financial situation. This time, I decided to investigate further. I requested a free credit report from one of the major credit bureaus, expecting to find the positive payment history that Aunt Cathy had been building on my behalf. What I discovered instead was deeply confusing and alarming. According to the credit report, I had multiple credit cards, a car loan, and even a mortgage, all accounts I had never opened or knew anything about. The addresses associated with these accounts were in Brookfield, near where Aunt Cathy lived, but not her exact address. The employment information listed a medical billing company, which was Aunt Cathy's field but not where I had ever worked. Most shocking of all was the reported income. According to the credit applications on file, I was earning over $75,000 per year, more than double what my father made and far beyond anything a college student could realistically earn. The dates on these accounts went back to when I was 16 years old, and the pattern of activity suggested someone was actively using these accounts on a regular basis. I stared at the credit report for hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The obvious explanation was that someone had stolen my identity, but the personal information was too accurate, and the timing too coincidental. Whoever was doing this had access to my social security number, my correct birth date, my mother's maiden name, and other details that only family members would know. The realization hit me gradually, like a slow-moving wave of nausea. The only person who had consistent access to my personal information, who had been involved in my financial matters since high school, and who worked in a field that gave her knowledge of how to manipulate financial systems, was Aunt Cathy. The woman who had helped raise me, who I trusted completely, was the only logical suspect. But suspecting someone and proving it are entirely different things. I needed more evidence before I could confront her or involve authorities. I spent the next several weeks gathering information, requesting detailed credit reports from all 3 major bureaus, and trying to piece together the scope of what had been done in my name. The full picture was staggering. Over the course of 6 years, someone using my identity had opened 17 different credit accounts, taken out 2 car loans, and even applied for a mortgage. The total debt accumulated in my name was approaching $200,000, though much of it appeared to be paid off regularly, suggesting that whoever was doing this had enough income to maintain the accounts. What disturbed me most was the sophistication of the operation. This wasn't someone making random purchases and running up debt. The accounts were being managed strategically, with payments made on time and credit utilization kept at reasonable levels. Someone was using my identity to build wealth and maintain a lifestyle that far exceeded their legitimate income. I realized I needed professional help to understand the legal and financial implications of what I had discovered. I made an appointment with a consumer protection attorney in Portland, bringing copies of all the credit reports and documentation I had gathered. The attorney, Sarah Mendez, specialized in identity theft cases and had seen similar situations before. After reviewing my evidence, Sarah confirmed my worst fears. This was definitely identity theft, and the pattern suggested it had been going on for years by someone with intimate knowledge of my personal information. The sophistication of the operation, and the fact that payments were being made, suggested the perpetrator had significant income and was using my identity to supplement their legitimate financial profile. Sarah explained that identity theft by family members was more common than people realized, and often more difficult to prosecute because of the emotional complications involved. She recommended that I first try to gather more concrete evidence linking the fraudulent accounts to Aunt Cathy before involving law enforcement. The attorney also warned me about potential complications with the IRS. If someone had been using my social security number for employment or business purposes, there could be tax implications that I would need to address. She recommended that I request copies of my Social Security earnings history to see if there were discrepancies in reported income. Following Sarah's advice, I submitted a request to the Social Security Administration for my complete earnings history. The response arrived 3 weeks later and contained information that made my blood run cold. According to Social Security records, I had been earning substantial income every year since I was 16 years old, with annual earnings ranging from $45,000 to over $100,000. The employer listed for most of these earnings was Pacific Coast Medical Solutions, a medical billing company located in Brookfield. I had never heard of this company, but a quick internet search revealed that it was owned by Catherine Hoffman, my Aunt Cathy. She hadn't just been using my identity for credit. She had been using my Social Security number as an employee at her own company, essentially paying herself twice while making it appear that I was earning substantial income. This revelation explains so much about the credit report discrepancies. The high income attributed to me had made it possible for someone to qualify for large credit limits and loans in my name. Aunt Cathy had been systematically using my identity to expand her borrowing capacity while maintaining the appearance of legitimate employment history. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. For over 6 years, she had been essentially living a double financial life: her legitimate identity and income, plus a shadow identity using my personal information that allowed her to access additional credit and financial opportunities. The total financial benefit to her was easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I felt sick thinking about all the times she had helped me with financial matters, knowing that she was simultaneously stealing my identity for her own gain. Every conversation about building credit, every piece of advice about financial responsibility, every expression of concern for my future had been tainted by her ongoing fraud. The emotional betrayal was almost harder to process than the financial crime. This wasn't a stranger who had somehow obtained my personal information. This was the woman who had held my hair when I was sick, who had taught me to drive, who had been my primary maternal figure for most of my adolescence. She had used her position of trust and love to systematically steal from me for years. I scheduled another meeting with Sarah to discuss the new evidence and plan our next steps. The attorney reviewed the Social Security earnings records and confirmed that this was now clearly a federal crime involving Social Security fraud, tax fraud, and identity theft. The evidence was strong enough to involve law enforcement, but she wanted to prepare me for the emotional and practical challenges ahead. Sarah explained that prosecuting a family member for identity theft was always complicated. There would likely be attempts to minimize the crime or claim that I had somehow given permission for the use of my identity. The family dynamics would be scrutinized, and I would need to be prepared for other family members to potentially take sides. There were also practical considerations about recovering the stolen money and repairing my credit. The process could take years and would require extensive documentation and cooperation with multiple agencies. Some of the fraudulent accounts might be difficult to dispute if they had been paid off and closed, even though they were opened illegally. Most challenging of all, I would need to confront Aunt Cathy directly at some point, either before involving law enforcement or as part of the legal process. Sarah recommended that I try to gather additional evidence first, possibly through a controlled conversation, where I might be able to get her to admit to some of the fraudulent activity. The idea of confronting the woman who had been like a second mother to me was terrifying. How do you ask someone who helped raise you whether they've been stealing your identity for years? How do you maintain composure when discussing something so personal and devastating with someone you once trusted completely? I decided to spend the winter break from college at home, using the time to gather more evidence and plan my approach. I told my father that I was having some credit issues and needed to sort through financial documents, which was true enough without revealing the full scope of what I suspected. He offered to help, but I explained that I wanted to handle it myself as part of becoming more financially independent. During this time, I conducted surveillance of sorts, paying attention to Aunt Cathy's lifestyle and spending patterns. I noticed things that hadn't registered before. Her car was much newer and more expensive than her legitimate income should have supported. Her apartment was in an upscale complex that seemed beyond her means, and she frequently made purchases and took trips that suggested she had more disposable income than a medical billing clerk should have. I also began paying closer attention to her work situation. Through casual conversation, I learned that Pacific Coast Medical Solutions was a small company that she had started several years earlier, transitioning from employee to business owner. The timeline coincided perfectly with when the fraudulent use of my identity had begun, suggesting that she may have used my Social Security number to help establish credit and financial credibility for her new business. The more I learned, the more I realized that this wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was a calculated long-term financial strategy. Aunt Cathy had systematically planned and executed a sophisticated identity theft operation that had allowed her to live beyond her means for years, while appearing to be a loving, supportive family member. As winter break came to an end and I prepared to return to college for my final semester, I knew I could no longer delay taking action. The evidence was overwhelming, and continuing to pretend that everything was normal was becoming impossible. I was spending every family gathering looking at Aunt Cathy differently, analyzing her comments for signs of deception, and feeling sick every time she expressed concern for my future or offered financial advice. I scheduled a final meeting with Sarah to finalize our strategy. We decided that I would attempt one recorded conversation with Aunt Cathy to see if I could get her to admit to any fraudulent activity. If that was unsuccessful, we would immediately involve law enforcement and begin the formal process of reporting the identity theft. The plan was risky because it might alert her to my suspicions and give her time to destroy evidence or further damage my credit. But Sarah felt that having a recorded admission would strengthen the case significantly and might lead to a quicker resolution if Aunt Cathy chose to cooperate rather than face prosecution. I spent several days rehearsing different approaches for the conversation, trying to find a way to bring up the credit issues naturally without immediately putting her on the defensive. The hardest part was accepting that this conversation would fundamentally change our relationship forever, regardless of the outcome. If she admitted to the fraud, I would have to decide whether to pursue criminal charges against someone who had been like a mother to me. If she denied it convincingly, I would be left questioning everything I thought I knew while still facing the reality of extensive identity theft. Either way, the trust and love that had defined our relationship for over a decade would be permanently damaged. The night before the planned conversation, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways Aunt Cathy had been there for me during the most difficult period of my life. She had filled a void left by my mother's death and had seemed to genuinely care about my well-being and success. How could someone who loved me also systematically steal from me for years? I realized that part of what made this betrayal so devastating was that it forced me to question whether her love and support had ever been genuine, or whether I had been nothing more than a convenient source of personal information for her fraudulent activities. Had she stepped in to help after my mother's death out of genuine family love, or because she saw an opportunity to gain access to a child's identity that she could exploit for decades? These questions haunted me as I prepared to confront the woman who had shaped so much of my adolescence and young adulthood. Tomorrow, I would find out whether the aunt I loved and trusted was also the person who had been stealing my financial future one fraudulent transaction at a time. The morning of my planned confrontation with Aunt Cathy arrived gray and drizzling, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched my mood perfectly. I had arranged to meet her at a small cafe in downtown Brookfield under the pretense of wanting to discuss my post-graduation plans. The location was public enough to feel safe, but private enough for a serious conversation, and I had chosen a table near the back where I could discreetly record our discussion using my phone. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordering a coffee I didn't want, and reviewing my mental notes one final time. My hands shook slightly as I tested the recording app on my phone, making sure the audio quality would be clear enough to capture whatever admissions I might be able to extract. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me like a physical force. When Aunt Cathy walked through the cafe door, I felt a complicated mix of emotions wash over me. She looked exactly as she always had, professionally dressed, carrying the same oversized purse she'd had for years, her graying hair pulled back in the neat bun she wore to work. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had made some terrible mistake, that this woman who had been so important to my life couldn't possibly be the sophisticated criminal I suspected her of being. She spotted me immediately and made her way over with a warm smile, stopping to give me the same affectionate hug she'd been giving me since I was 11 years old. The familiar scent of her vanilla perfume and the way she squeezed my shoulders brought back a flood of memories from the years when she had been my primary source of maternal comfort. We spent the first few minutes on small talk about my final semester of college, my student teaching placement, and my plans for finding a job after graduation. Aunt Cathy seemed genuinely interested in my career prospects and offered several suggestions for school districts that might be hiring new teachers. Her advice seemed heartfelt and practical, making what I was about to do feel even more surreal. After about 10 minutes of casual conversation, I steered the discussion toward finances by mentioning that I had been trying to get my financial affairs in order before graduation. I explained that I had been reviewing my credit report and had found some confusing information that I hoped she might be able to help me understand. Aunt Cathy's expression didn't change noticeably, but I thought I detected a slight stiffening in her posture when I mentioned the credit report. She asked what kind of confusing information I had found, her tone carefully neutral in a way that seemed slightly forced. I explained that there were several accounts on my credit report that I didn't remember opening, including credit cards and loans that showed much higher income than I had ever earned. I told her that I was worried someone might have stolen my identity and asked if she had any idea how that could have happened or what I should do about it. Her response was carefully measured and initially seemed helpful. She suggested that credit reports often contained errors, and that the first step should be to dispute any inaccurate information with the credit bureaus. She offered to help me draft dispute letters, and recommended that I be very careful about how I handled the situation to avoid damaging my credit score. As she spoke, I found myself analyzing every word and gesture for signs of deception. Her advice was technically sound and seemed to come from genuine concern, but there was something slightly rehearsed about her responses, as if she had prepared for this conversation. She asked detailed questions about which specific accounts I had found and which credit bureau had provided the report, information that could help her assess how much I actually knew. I decided to probe deeper by mentioning that some of the accounts showed employment at a medical billing company in Brookfield. I watched her face carefully as I said this, looking for any reaction that might confirm my suspicions. For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise? Recognition, or maybe calculation. But it passed so quickly that I couldn't be certain. Aunt Cathy suggested that the employment information was probably just another error in the credit report. She pointed out that medical billing companies often had similar names, and that the credit bureaus might have confused information from different people with the same name. Her explanation was plausible, but it felt overly elaborate for what should have been a simple misunderstanding. I pressed further by mentioning that I had also requested my Social Security earnings history and had found income reported that I had never earned. This was when I saw the first clear sign that she was becoming uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat and took a longer pause before responding, and when she did speak, her voice was slightly tighter than before. She suggested that Social Security records were notoriously unreliable, and that I should probably request a correction of my earnings history before it caused problems with future benefit calculations. She offered to help me navigate the Social Security bureaucracy, claiming that her work in medical billing had given her experience dealing with government agencies. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with me gradually revealing more of what I had discovered while watching carefully for her reactions. With each new piece of information I shared, she seemed to become more guarded while maintaining the appearance of helpful concern. Her explanations became increasingly complex and detailed, as if she was working hard to construct plausible alternative explanations for what I had found. Finally, I decided to take a more direct approach. I told her that the pattern of fraudulent activity was too sophisticated and too personal to be random identity theft. I explained that whoever was doing this had access to detailed personal information and seemed to know exactly how to manipulate credit and employment systems. I asked her directly if she had any idea who might have that kind of access to my personal information. This question seemed to catch her off guard. For the first time in our conversation, she appeared genuinely flustered and took several seconds to formulate a response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there before. She reminded me that many people had access to my personal information over the years: school administrators, medical offices, government agencies, and various family members. She seemed almost offended that I was implying the fraud had to be someone close to me, suggesting instead that I should focus on external threats, like data breaches or mail theft. I realized that she wasn't going to voluntarily admit to anything, and that continuing to push might alert her to the full extent of my suspicions. I decided to end the recorded conversation and move forward with involving law enforcement. I thanked her for her advice and promised to start disputing the fraudulent accounts immediately. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Aunt Cathy made one final comment that chilled me to the bone. She mentioned that I should be very careful about making accusations without solid proof, because identity theft investigations could sometimes reveal embarrassing or complicated family situations that everyone would prefer to keep private. The comment was ostensibly about protecting myself, but it felt distinctly like a threat. That evening, I called Sarah to report on the conversation and share the recording. After listening to the entire discussion, she confirmed that while Aunt Cathy hadn't made any direct admissions, her responses were consistent with someone who had detailed knowledge of the fraudulent activity. Her advice about credit disputes and Social Security corrections was too specific and well-informed for someone who was genuinely surprised by the situation. Sarah recommended that we move forward with filing a police report and notifying the relevant federal agencies. She warned me that once we took this step, there would be no going back. Aunt Cathy would inevitably learn about the investigation, and our family relationships would be permanently altered regardless of the outcome. I spent the weekend wrestling with the decision. Part of me still hoped there might be some alternative explanation that would preserve my relationship with Aunt Cathy while resolving the identity theft. But the rational part of my mind knew that the evidence was overwhelming and that delaying action would only give her more time to potentially cause additional damage. On Monday morning, I went to the FBI field office in Portland to file a formal complaint about the identity theft. The agent I spoke with, Special Agent Martinez, specialized in financial crimes and had extensive experience with identity theft cases. After reviewing all my documentation and listening to portions of the recorded conversation with Aunt Cathy, he confirmed that I had strong grounds for a federal investigation. Agent Martinez explained that the case would likely involve multiple agencies since it crossed several areas of federal law: Social Security fraud, tax fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. The investigation would take time, possibly months or even years, and would require extensive cooperation from me in documenting the full scope of the fraud. He also warned me about the emotional challenges of prosecuting a family member. He had worked similar cases before and knew that the psychological impact on victims could be severe, especially when the perpetrator was someone who had been trusted and loved. He recommended that I consider counseling to help process the betrayal and prepare for the difficult legal process ahead. The formal investigation began within days of my filing the complaint. Federal agents visited Pacific Coast Medical Solutions to examine employment records and interview other employees about my supposed work history. They also began the process of subpoenaing financial records from the various banks and credit companies where fraudulent accounts had been opened in my name. I wasn't privy to all the details of the investigation, but Agent Martinez kept me informed of major developments. Within 2 weeks, they had confirmed that my Social Security number had been used fraudulently for employment purposes at Aunt Cathy's company. The payroll records showed that I had been listed as an employee for over 6 years, with regular paychecks being issued to bank accounts that I had never opened. The bank records revealed an even more sophisticated operation than I had initially suspected. Aunt Cathy had opened multiple accounts in my name, using variations of addresses near her home and workplace. These accounts were used to receive the fraudulent paychecks and to manage the various credit accounts she had opened. The money was then systematically transferred to accounts in her real name or used to make purchases that benefited her directly. The total amount of money that had flowed through accounts opened in my name was staggering, over $800,000 over the course of 6 years. While not all of this represented direct theft, since much of it had been used to pay off the fraudulent credit accounts, the scope of the operation was far beyond anything I had imagined when I first discovered the fraudulent accounts on my credit report. 3 weeks after I filed the complaint, Agent Martinez called to inform me that they were ready to make an arrest. They had gathered enough evidence to charge Aunt Cathy with multiple federal crimes, and they wanted to coordinate with me about the timing, since they knew this would have significant family implications. I asked if I could be the one to tell my father before the arrest happened. He deserved to hear about this from me, rather than learning about it when federal agents showed up at his sister's workplace. Agent Martinez agreed to delay the arrest for 24 hours to give me time to have that conversation. Telling my father about Aunt Cathy's crimes was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I had prepared extensively, gathering copies of all the evidence and planning how to present the information as clearly and objectively as possible. But no amount of preparation could have made it easier to watch my father's face as I explained that his sister had been systematically stealing from his daughter for years. His initial reaction was complete disbelief. He insisted that there must be some mistake, that Cathy would never do something like this to our family. He reminded me of all the ways she had helped us after my mother died and questioned whether I might have misunderstood something about the financial records. As I showed him the evidence piece by piece, the credit reports, the Social Security earnings records, the bank statements that agents had obtained, I watched his disbelief gradually transform into shock and then into a deep, painful anger. The sister he had trusted to help raise his daughter had been betraying that trust in the most fundamental way possible. My father's anger wasn't directed at me, but I could see that he was struggling with guilt about having allowed Aunt Cathy such access to my personal information. He blamed himself for not being more involved in my financial affairs, and for trusting his sister so completely with matters that should have remained within our immediate family. The conversation lasted several hours, with my father asking detailed questions about how the fraud had worked and how long it had been going on. He seemed particularly disturbed by the sophistication of the operation and the fact that Aunt Cathy had been living a double financial life while maintaining the appearance of being a loving, supportive family member. By the end of our discussion, my father was supportive of my decision to involve law enforcement, though I could see that it was breaking his heart. Aunt Cathy was his only remaining sibling, and the prospect of her going to prison for crimes against his daughter was almost incomprehensible to him. But he also understood that what she had done was serious enough to warrant serious consequences. The next morning, federal agents arrested Aunt Cathy at her office. I wasn't present for the arrest, but Agent Martinez called me afterward to let me know that it had gone smoothly. She had not resisted arrest and had asked for an attorney immediately, which was her right, but also suggested that she understood the seriousness of the charges against her. The arrest made the local news, though the reporters didn't have access to many details since it was an ongoing federal investigation. The story was brief, mentioning only that a local business owner had been arrested on charges related to identity theft and Social Security fraud. But in a small community like ours, even that limited information was enough to generate significant speculation and gossip. I had anticipated that the arrest would create complications in my extended family relationships, but I wasn't prepared for how quickly sides would be chosen. Some family members were supportive and expressed shock at what Aunt Cathy had done. Others seemed to view me as a traitor for involving law enforcement in what they considered a family matter that should have been resolved privately. My father's brother, Uncle Robert, was particularly critical of my decision to press charges. He argued that families should stick together, and that there must have been a way to handle the situation without destroying Aunt Cathy's life. He seemed to believe that the financial harm to me was less important than maintaining family unity, a perspective that I found both hurtful and infuriating. The family division was painful, but it also helped me understand how Aunt Cathy had been able to operate undetected for so long. There was a culture of family loyalty that discouraged too much scrutiny of each other's affairs and that prioritized harmony over accountability. In that environment, questioning Aunt Cathy's financial situation or her access to my personal information would have been seen as inappropriate and disloyal. While dealing with the family fallout, I also had to begin the complex process of repairing the damage to my credit and financial records. This involved filing disputes with all 3 credit bureaus, working with banks to close fraudulent accounts, and coordinating with various government agencies to correct my employment and earnings histories. The process was incredibly time-consuming and bureaucratic, requiring countless phone calls, certified letters, and detailed affidavits explaining the situation. Each agency had its own procedures and requirements, and progress was often frustratingly slow. Some institutions were helpful and understanding, while others seemed skeptical of my claims despite the ongoing federal investigation. One of the most challenging aspects was dealing with the tax implications of the fraudulent income that had been reported in my name. The IRS had records showing that I had earned substantial income over several years without filing tax returns, which technically made me liable for significant penalties and interest charges, even though I had never actually received the money. Resolving this required working with a tax attorney who specialized in identity theft cases. We had to file amended returns for multiple years, provide extensive documentation of the fraud, and request abatement of penalties and interest charges. The process took months and required multiple meetings with IRS agents who needed to verify that I had been the victim of identity theft rather than simply someone trying to avoid tax obligations. During this period, I also had to complete my final semester of college while dealing with the stress and time demands of the ongoing legal situation. My academic performance suffered somewhat, though I managed to graduate on schedule with my teaching degree. This student teaching placement that should have been an exciting culmination of my education was overshadowed by constant phone calls from attorneys and investigators. My relationship with Aunt Cathy's defense attorney was particularly complicated. He contacted me several times seeking information about our family relationship and asking whether I would be willing to consider a plea agreement that might involve restitution but less prison time. He portrayed Aunt Cathy as someone who had made poor decisions but who genuinely cared about me and regretted the harm she had caused. These conversations were emotionally difficult because they forced me to confront the complexity of my feelings about Aunt Cathy. Despite everything she had done, part of me still remembered the woman who had helped me through the most difficult period of my childhood. The defense attorney seemed to understand this internal conflict and appealed to my sense of compassion and family loyalty. However, Agent Martinez and my attorney Sarah both advised me that any plea agreement would need to include full restitution for all damages and a significant prison sentence to reflect the seriousness and duration of the crimes. They warned me that showing too much leniency might encourage other family members to commit similar crimes and would not adequately address the federal violations that had occurred. As the case moved through the legal system, more details emerged about the full scope of Aunt Cathy's fraudulent activities. The investigation revealed that she had been using my identity not just for credit and employment fraud, but also for various business dealings related to her medical billing company. She had used my Social Security number to apply for business loans and credit lines, essentially making me an unwitting partner in her business ventures. The business fraud was particularly sophisticated and had allowed her to qualify for larger loans and better terms than she could have obtained using only her legitimate identity and income. She had created an elaborate paper trail showing me as a highly compensated employee and business partner, which helped her secure credit for equipment purchases, office space, and working capital. This revelation explained how she had been able to afford her lifestyle and business expansion while maintaining the appearance of being a modestly paid administrative assistant. She had essentially been living as two different people financially, her legitimate identity with limited income and credit, and my stolen identity with substantial earnings and excellent credit history. The psychological impact of learning about these additional layers of fraud was significant. Each new revelation forced me to reconsider another aspect of my relationship with Aunt Cathy and to question whether anything about her concern for my welfare had been genuine. Had she really cared about my education and future success, or had she simply been protecting her investment in my identity? These questions became even more pressing when the investigation revealed that Aunt Cathy had been monitoring my credit report regularly, presumably to ensure that I didn't discover the fraudulent accounts. She had used her legitimate access to my personal information to set up credit monitoring services in my name, which allowed her to track any changes or inquiries that might indicate I was becoming aware of the fraud. This meant that she had known exactly when I first requested my credit report during college and had been tracking my subsequent attempts to understand the discrepancies. Her helpful advice about credit disputes and Social Security corrections had been designed to discourage me from pursuing the matter too aggressively, while giving her time to prepare for the possibility that I might discover the truth. The calculation and premeditation involved in these actions was chilling. This wasn't someone who had made a single bad decision or who had stolen my identity impulsively. This was someone who had planned and executed a sophisticated long-term fraud while simultaneously maintaining a loving relationship with me and carefully monitoring my efforts to understand what was happening. 6 months after Aunt Cathy's arrest, her case finally went to trial. I had to testify about our family relationship and about how I had discovered the fraud. The experience of testifying against someone who had been so important to my life was emotionally devastating, but I knew that my testimony was necessary to ensure that justice was served. During my testimony, I had to describe in detail how Aunt Cathy had gained access to my personal information and how she had used her position of trust to commit the fraud. I also had to explain the impact that the identity theft had on my financial life and my ability to establish credit as a young adult. The defense attorney tried to portray the relationship as more complicated than simple fraud, suggesting that there had been a family understanding that I would eventually benefit from Aunt Cathy's business success. He argued that she had intended to make me a legitimate partner in her business, and that the use of my identity was a misguided attempt to help me build credit and financial history. This defense strategy was particularly painful because it forced me to explicitly reject any suggestion that I had benefited from or consented to the use of my identity. I had to make it clear that I had never agreed to be listed as an employee of her company, had never received any compensation for the use of my Social Security number, and had never been informed about any supposed business partnership. The prosecution's case was strong, built on extensive documentation of the fraudulent accounts, the forged employment records, and the systematic transfer of money from accounts opened in my name to accounts controlled by Aunt Cathy. They were able to demonstrate that this was a sophisticated, premeditated scheme that had continued for years despite multiple opportunities for her to stop or to inform me about what she was doing. After a week-long trial, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Aunt Cathy was convicted of identity theft, Social Security fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments about the appropriate punishment. The conviction was a relief, but it also marked the beginning of another difficult phase of the process. I now had to decide whether to provide input on sentencing and whether to seek maximum penalties for someone who had been like a mother to me for most of my adolescence. The victim impact statement I was invited to submit would be my opportunity to explain how the fraud had affected my life and what I thought would be appropriate consequences. Writing that statement was one of the most challenging things I had ever done. I had to balance my desire for justice and accountability with my complicated feelings about someone who had played such an important role in my life. I also had to consider the impact on other family members, including my father, who would be affected by whatever sentence Aunt Cathy received. Ultimately, I decided to write a statement that focused on the facts of how the fraud had affected me, rather than making specific recommendations about punishment. I described the financial damage, the time and stress involved in repairing my credit, and the emotional impact of being betrayed by someone I had trusted completely. I also mentioned the broader impact on our family relationships and the difficulty of rebuilding trust after such a fundamental betrayal. The sentencing hearing was attended by several family members, creating a tense atmosphere as people who disagreed about my decision to prosecute sat in the same courtroom. I could feel the judgment and resentment from some relatives who still believed I should have handled the matter privately, while others offered their support for my decision to seek justice. Before imposing sentence, the judge allowed Aunt Cathy to make a statement. For the first time since her arrest, she spoke directly to me, offering what appeared to be a genuine apology for the harm she had caused. She claimed that her actions had started small and escalated beyond her control, and that she had never intended to cause lasting damage to my financial future. Her statement was emotional and seemed heartfelt, but it also contained justifications and explanations that suggested she still didn't fully understand or accept responsibility for what she had done. She mentioned the financial pressures of starting her business and the difficulty of managing everything after my mother's death, as if these circumstances somehow excused her decision to steal my identity. The judge was not swayed by these explanations. In imposing sentence, she noted the sophisticated and prolonged nature of the fraud, the abuse of a position of trust, and the significant financial impact on the victim. She sentenced Aunt Cathy to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution for all documented damages. The sentence was longer than I had expected, and longer than some family members thought was appropriate, but it reflected the seriousness of federal identity theft crimes and the aggravating factors involved in this particular case. The judge made it clear that family relationships did not excuse criminal behavior, and that trust positions carried additional responsibilities rather than additional protections. As Aunt Cathy was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. Justice had been served, but at the cost of destroying relationships that had once been central to my life. The woman who had helped raise me was going to spend the next 5 years in prison because of crimes she had committed against me. The aftermath of the sentencing was as difficult as I had anticipated. Several family members blamed me for Aunt Cathy's imprisonment and suggested that I had been vindictive in pursuing prosecution. Others expressed support for my decision, but remained uncomfortable with the family conflict that had resulted. My relationship with my father remained strong throughout this period. While he was devastated by his sister's actions and the family division that followed, he never wavered in his support for my decision to seek justice. He understood that allowing such serious crimes to go unpunished would have sent the wrong message, and might have encouraged similar behavior in the future. The process of rebuilding my financial life continued for months after the trial ended. Even with Aunt Cathy's conviction, disputing all the fraudulent accounts and correcting my credit history was a slow, bureaucratic process that required constant follow-up and documentation. Some institutions were more cooperative than others, and a few accounts remained on my credit report for years despite clear evidence that they were fraudulent. The restitution process was also complicated and ultimately incomplete. While the court had ordered Aunt Cathy to pay back all the money she had stolen, she had limited assets and would have minimal earning capacity while in prison. The restitution would likely take years to collect, if it could ever be collected in full. More importantly, for my immediate needs, I had to rebuild my credit history and establish my legitimate financial identity. This meant starting from scratch with secured credit cards and small loans, gradually building a credit history that accurately reflected my actual income and financial behavior. It was frustrating to have to rebuild something that should have been mine all along, but it was necessary for my future financial stability. The emotional healing process was equally challenging and took much longer than the legal proceedings. I struggled with feelings of anger, betrayal, and grief for the relationship that had been lost. I also had to work through complicated feelings of guilt about sending someone I loved to prison, even though I knew rationally that it had been the right decision. Counseling helped me understand that these conflicted feelings were normal for victims of fraud by family members. The therapist I worked with specialized in trauma and betrayal, and she helped me recognize that loving someone didn't mean I had to tolerate criminal behavior or sacrifice my own well-being to protect them from consequences of their actions. The months following Aunt Cathy's sentencing brought unexpected challenges that I hadn't anticipated during the height of the legal proceedings. While I had focused intensely on proving the fraud and securing a conviction, I hadn't fully prepared for the complex reality of rebuilding my life while dealing with the ongoing consequences of her crimes. The most immediate problem was the IRS situation that had initially triggered my discovery of the identity theft. Even though Aunt Cathy had been convicted and the fraudulent income had been documented, the tax agency moved slowly to correct my records. According to their systems, I still owed substantial back taxes on income I had never received, and the automated collection notices continued arriving weekly despite my repeated attempts to explain the situation. Working with my tax attorney, we filed for innocent spouse relief and submitted extensive documentation, proving that I had been the victim of identity theft. The process required multiple meetings with IRS agents, each of whom seemed to need the same evidence explained from the beginning. The bureaucratic maze was exhausting, and progress felt impossibly slow when automated systems continued generating collection notices for taxes on income I had never earned. The breakthrough came when we finally reached an IRS agent who specialized in identity theft cases. Agent Patricia Chen had seen similar situations before and understood the complex documentation required to unravel years of fraudulent tax filings. She guided us through the process of filing amended returns for each year that Aunt Cathy had used my Social Security number for employment, systematically correcting the record to show zero income for those periods. The amended returns had to be filed with special identity theft affidavits and supporting documentation from the criminal case. Each return required detailed explanations of how the fraudulent income had been reported and why it should be removed from my record. The process took 8 months to complete, but eventually resulted in the IRS acknowledging that I owed no back taxes and that my legitimate tax record showed only the modest income I had actually earned. During this same period, I was struggling to establish myself professionally as a new teacher while dealing with the ongoing stress of the financial recovery process. I had accepted a position at Lincoln Elementary School in Portland, teaching 3rd grade to a classroom of energetic 8-year-olds who had no idea their teacher was spending her evenings on phone calls with credit bureaus and federal agencies. Teaching had always been my dream career, but my first year was more challenging than I had expected even without the additional stress of the identity theft situation. Managing 23 third graders required every bit of energy and creativity I could muster, and I often found myself exhausted by the end of each school day. Adding hours of paperwork and phone calls related to credit disputes made for 18-hour days that left little time for self-care or social life. My principal, Dr. Sandra Williams, was understanding when I explained that I was dealing with a family legal situation that sometimes required me to take phone calls during lunch breaks or stay late to make up time lost to attorney meetings. She didn't pry into the details, but she made it clear that she supported me and appreciated my dedication to my students despite the personal challenges I was facing. The students themselves became an unexpected source of healing during this difficult period. Their enthusiasm and genuine affection reminded me daily that there was goodness and trust in the world, even when my faith and family relationships had been severely damaged. Working with children who looked up to me and depended on me helped restore my sense of purpose and value beyond the financial damage that had been done. One particularly meaningful moment came during a lesson about honesty and trustworthiness. One of my students, a girl named Emma whose parents were going through a difficult divorce, asked whether it was possible for someone you love to lie to you about important things. The question hit close to home, and I found myself carefully crafting an age-appropriate response about how sometimes people make bad choices that hurt the people who care about them. I explained that when someone breaks trust, it doesn't mean we should stop trusting everyone, but it does mean we need to be careful about who we trust and how much we trust them. Emma nodded seriously and said she understood, and I realized that I was giving advice to myself as much as to her. The experience of helping children navigate complex emotional situations helped me process my own feelings about betrayal and recovery. As my first year of teaching progressed, I also began the slow process of rebuilding social relationships that had been neglected during the intense period of legal proceedings. The stress and time demands of dealing with the identity theft had isolated me from friends and potential romantic relationships, and I realized that I needed to make a conscious effort to reconnect with the world beyond courtrooms and credit disputes. I started by reaching out to college friends who had moved to the Portland area after graduation. Many of them were also beginning their careers and navigating the challenges of young adulthood, though none had dealt with anything quite like what I had experienced. Their normalcy was both comforting and slightly alienating, as I struggled to relate to complaints about student loan payments when I had been dealing with fraudulent accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. One friend, Jessica, had taken a job at a marketing firm downtown and often invited me to happy hour events with her colleagues. These social gatherings were opportunities to practice being normal again, to have conversations about work and relationships and future plans, without the constant undercurrent of legal stress that had dominated my life for the past year. It was at one of these happy hour events that I met David, a graphic designer who worked for a nonprofit environmental organization. He was quiet and thoughtful, with an easy smile and a genuine interest in learning about the people around him. When he asked what I did for work, I was able to simply say that I taught third grade, without having to explain the complicated legal situation that had been consuming my life. Our early conversations were refreshingly normal. We talked about teaching and design, about books and movies, about weekend hiking plans and favorite restaurants. David had grown up in a stable, loving family and had never experienced anything like betrayal by a trusted family member. His innocence about such things was both appealing and slightly intimidating, as I wondered whether someone who had never experienced deep betrayal could understand the caution and guardedness that had become part of my personality. As we began dating, I struggled with when and how to tell David about the identity theft situation. The legal proceedings were mostly complete, but the financial recovery process was ongoing, and the emotional impact continued to affect my daily life. I worried that the story would overwhelm a new relationship, and that David might question whether I came with too much baggage for a casual dating situation. After 2 months of dating, I decided to tell him the full story during a weekend camping trip to the Oregon coast. We were sitting by a campfire on the beach, watching the sunset over the Pacific, when I began explaining why I sometimes seemed distracted by phone calls from attorneys and credit agencies. David listened without interruption as I described the discovery of the fraud, the investigation, and the trial. His reaction was everything I had hoped for, and nothing I had expected to receive so easily. He was shocked by the sophistication of the fraud and angry on my behalf about the betrayal by someone who should have protected me. But he was also impressed by my strength in pursuing justice and my resilience in rebuilding my life. Most importantly, he didn't treat me as damaged goods or seem overwhelmed by the complexity of what I had experienced. David's support became increasingly important as I continued dealing with the ongoing challenges of financial recovery. Some credit accounts remained difficult to dispute, particularly those that had been opened early in the fraud and had been managed responsibly for years. The credit bureaus seemed reluctant to remove accounts that showed positive payment history, even when they had been opened fraudulently. The process of rebuilding my legitimate credit history was also more challenging than I had anticipated. Starting with secured credit cards and small loans meant accepting higher interest rates and lower credit limits while I slowly demonstrated my creditworthiness. It was frustrating to be penalized financially for being the victim of someone else's crimes, but I understood that the system had no way to instantly restore the credit history I should have had. One unexpected complication arose when I applied for a mortgage to buy my own home. Despite having steady income as a teacher and money saved for a down payment, my credit history was too short and too complicated for conventional loan approval. The underwriters couldn't reconcile the fraudulent accounts that were gradually being removed with the legitimate financial profile I was trying to establish. I ended up working with a specialized lender who had experience with identity theft victims. The loan officer, Margaret Torres, walked me through additional documentation requirements and helped me present my case in a way that satisfied the underwriters' concerns. The process took 4 months instead of the typical 6 weeks, but I was eventually approved for a modest mortgage on a small house in southeast Portland. Buying my first home felt like a major milestone in reclaiming my financial independence, but it also brought unexpected emotional challenges. The house hunting process forced me to confront how much the identity theft had affected my risk tolerance and decision-making. I found myself being overly cautious about financial commitments and second-guessing decisions that should have been straightforward. David accompanied me to house showings and helped me work through the anxiety that arose whenever I had to provide personal financial information to real estate agents or lenders. His calm presence and logical perspective helped balance my tendency to catastrophize about potential financial disasters. He reminded me that normal financial transactions weren't threats, and that I could trust my own judgment about what I could afford. The house I eventually bought was a 1940s bungalow that needed cosmetic updates, but had good bones, and was located in a neighborhood with excellent schools. It represented a fresh start and a return to normal financial life, but it also symbolized how much my life had been shaped by Aunt Cathy's crimes. Without the identity theft, I might have had better credit and more housing options, but I tried to focus on gratitude for what I had achieved rather than resentment about what had been stolen. Moving into my own home coincided with the beginning of my second year of teaching, and both changes helped reinforce my sense of moving forward rather than remaining stuck in the victim role. My classroom management skills had improved significantly, and I was beginning to develop my own teaching style rather than simply surviving each day. The combination of professional growth and personal stability created a foundation for continued healing. Around this time, I received an unexpected letter from Aunt Cathy. She had been in federal prison for 18 months and was apparently allowed to send limited correspondence. The letter was brief and carefully worded, probably reviewed by prison officials, but it contained what seemed like a genuine apology for the harm she had caused. She wrote that she thought about me often and regretted the choices that had led to the destruction of our relationship. She mentioned that she was participating in financial responsibility classes and counseling programs that had helped her understand the impact of her actions. The letter concluded with a request for forgiveness, though she didn't ask me to visit or respond if I wasn't ready to do so. Reading the letter brought up complicated emotions that I thought I had resolved. Part of me felt manipulated by what could have been a calculated attempt to gain sympathy or reduce her sentence through good behavior. But another part of me recognized echoes of the aunt who had genuinely cared about me during my childhood, and I wondered whether there might be some possibility of eventual reconciliation. I discussed the letter with my therapist, who helped me understand that forgiveness was a process rather than a single decision. She explained that I could acknowledge Aunt Cathy's apology without feeling obligated to rebuild the relationship or forget about the harm that had been done. Forgiveness, she emphasized, was primarily about my own healing rather than about absolving Aunt Cathy of responsibility for her choices. After several weeks of consideration, I decided to write a brief response acknowledging receipt of her letter, but making it clear that I needed more time before considering any kind of relationship repair. I explained that while I appreciated her apology, rebuilding trust would require consistent demonstration of changed behavior over time, not just words written from prison. The process of writing that response helped me clarify my own boundaries and expectations. I realized that while I might eventually be able to forgive Aunt Cathy for my own peace of mind, I had no obligation to restore the close relationship we had once shared. Trust, once broken so fundamentally, might never be fully repaired, and that was an acceptable outcome. My relationship with other family members continued to evolve during this period as well. Some relatives who had initially criticized my decision to prosecute Aunt Cathy gradually came to understand the seriousness of what she had done, as more details became public through the court proceedings. Others remained convinced that family loyalty should have trumped legal accountability, creating permanent rifts in extended family relationships. My father remained my strongest supporter throughout this period, though I could see that the situation continued to cause him pain. He struggled with guilt about not protecting me from his sister's crimes, and with grief over the loss of the relationship he had shared with Aunt Cathy. We began attending family counseling together to work through these complicated emotions and to strengthen our own relationship. The counseling sessions helped us both understand how Aunt Cathy had manipulated family dynamics to enable her crimes. She had positioned herself as indispensable, while gradually gaining access to information and opportunities that allowed her to exploit my identity. The therapist helped us recognize patterns of behavior that we hadn't seen clearly while they were happening. One particularly valuable insight was understanding how Aunt Cathy had used my mother's death as cover for her criminal activity. By stepping in to help during our family crisis, she had gained sympathy and trust that made it difficult for anyone to question her motives or actions. The grief and gratitude we felt toward her had created blind spots that she exploited for years. This understanding helped reduce my father's feelings of guilt and self-blame. He came to see that he had been manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities and his desire to do right by his daughter. The recognition that he had been a victim too, albeit in a different way, helped us both move forward with less self-recrimination. As I approached the end of my second year of teaching, I began to feel like I had truly turned a corner in my recovery from the identity theft. My credit score had improved significantly, most of the fraudulent accounts had been successfully disputed, and my legitimate financial profile was becoming well established. The daily stress of dealing with credit agencies and legal issues had faded to occasional follow-up calls and paperwork. More importantly, I had rebuilt my sense of trust in my own judgment and my ability to navigate complex situations. The experience of successfully prosecuting Aunt Cathy and rebuilding my financial life had given me confidence that I could handle whatever challenges might arise in the future. I no longer felt like a victim, but rather like someone who had survived a serious betrayal and become stronger as a result. My relationship with David had also deepened over the months, and we began discussing moving in together. He had been patient and supportive throughout my recovery process, and his presence in my life had helped restore my faith in the possibility of healthy, trusting relationships. His family had welcomed me warmly, providing examples of functional family dynamics that helped heal some of the wounds left by my own family's dysfunction. The decision to move in together felt like another important step toward normalcy and future-focused living, rather than past-focused recovery. We found a larger rental house that could accommodate both of our belongings and provide space for the hobbies and interests that had been neglected during the crisis period. Around this time, I also received news that Aunt Cathy was eligible for early release due to good behavior and completion of various prison programs. She would be released to a halfway house after serving 3 years of her 5-year sentence, followed by the 3 years of supervised probation that had been part of her original sentence. The news brought up anxiety that I hadn't felt in months. While I knew intellectually that her release didn't pose a direct threat to me, the idea of her being free while I was still dealing with occasional consequences of her crimes felt somehow unfair. I worried about the possibility of contact or about having to see her at family events, though such encounters seemed unlikely given the ongoing family divisions. My probation officer, Agent Reynolds, contacted me to discuss safety planning and to ensure that I understood the conditions of Aunt Cathy's supervised release. She would be prohibited from contacting me directly and would have limited access to financial services and personal information databases that could enable further identity theft. Any violation of these conditions would result in immediate return to prison. Agent Reynolds also informed me that Aunt Cathy would be required to continue making restitution payments as a condition of her supervised release. The payments had been minimal while she was in prison, but she would now be required to find employment and dedicate a significant portion of her earnings to repaying the money she had stolen. This felt like a form of justice that went beyond the symbolic satisfaction of her imprisonment. The prospect of receiving regular restitution payments was both gratifying and complicated. On one hand, it represented acknowledgement that I had been harmed and deserved compensation. On the other hand, it meant maintaining a connection to Aunt Cathy through the financial system for years to come. Each monthly payment would be a reminder of what had happened, preventing me from completely moving past the experience. As my third year of teaching began, I decided to pursue National Board Certification, a prestigious credential that would enhance my career prospects and provide evidence of my professional growth. The certification process required extensive documentation of teaching practices and student outcomes, as well as rigorous written examinations covering educational theory and practice. Working toward this goal provided positive focus and helped establish my identity as an accomplished professional rather than primarily as a victim of financial crimes. The process was demanding but rewarding, requiring me to reflect deeply on my teaching philosophy and methods. It also connected me with other ambitious educators who were pursuing similar goals. The certification process coincided with David's decision to start his own design consultancy, creating a period of mutual professional growth and support. We encouraged each other through the challenges of pursuing ambitious goals while maintaining our relationship and managing the ordinary responsibilities of adult life. During this period, I also began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that provided support to identity theft victims. My experience with the complex legal and financial recovery process had given me insights that could help other people navigate similar challenges. Working with recent victims reminded me how far I had come in my own recovery, while providing meaningful ways to use my experience to help others. The volunteer work involved staffing a hotline that provided initial guidance to people who had discovered identity theft, helping them understand their rights and the steps they needed to take to protect themselves. Many callers were overwhelmed and frightened by the discovery that someone had been using their personal information, and I could offer both practical advice and emotional support based on my own experience. One particularly memorable call came from a young woman whose mother had been using her Social Security number to open utility accounts and credit cards. The caller was torn between protecting herself financially and maintaining her relationship with her mother, a conflict I understood intimately. I was able to help her understand that setting boundaries and seeking justice weren't acts of betrayal, but rather necessary steps for her own protection and well-being. These conversations reinforced my understanding that family financial abuse was more common than most people realized, and that victims often faced additional challenges because of the emotional complications involved in prosecuting someone they loved. The shame and isolation that many victims felt were familiar emotions that I had worked through with professional help. As Aunt Cathy's release date approached, I made the decision to write a victim impact statement for her probation officer that would become part of her permanent file. The statement described the ongoing impact of her crimes on my life and emphasized the importance of strict supervision and continued restitution payments. I wanted to ensure that the authorities understood the seriousness of what she had done and the need for continued accountability. Writing the statement also provided an opportunity for personal reflection on how much my life had changed since discovering the identity theft. While the experience had been traumatic and had created lasting effects, it had also led to personal growth, stronger relationships with people who had supported me, and a clearer understanding of my own values and boundaries. I realized that I had become more cautious about financial matters and more aware of privacy and security issues, but these changes felt like reasonable adaptations, rather than paranoid overreactions. I had also developed a deeper appreciation for honest relationships, and a lower tolerance for manipulation or deception in any form. The statement concluded with my perspective on what justice meant in this case. While prison time had been important for accountability and deterrence, true justice required ongoing acknowledgement of the harm that had been done, and concrete steps to repair that harm through restitution and changed behavior. I emphasized that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be earned through consistent demonstration of responsibility, rather than simply through the passage of time. By the time Aunt Cathy was actually released to the halfway house, I felt prepared for this transition and confident in my ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while continuing to focus on my own life and goals. The woman who had discovered fraudulent accounts on her credit report several years earlier had evolved into someone who understood her own strength and resilience. My relationship with David had progressed to discussions of marriage, and we began planning a wedding that would celebrate our partnership and our shared commitment to building an honest, supportive life together. The guest list would include family members who had supported me through the crisis and friends who had become chosen family during my recovery process. Notably absent from our wedding plans would be several extended family members who had prioritized loyalty to Aunt Cathy over accountability for her crimes. While this felt sad, it also felt like a healthy boundary that reflected my evolved understanding of what family relationships should provide. True family support meant standing up for what was right rather than enabling harmful behavior. The wedding planning process provided opportunities to practice the financial skills and cautious optimism I had developed during my recovery. Working with vendors, managing deposits, and coordinating payments felt like normal adult activities rather than potential threats to my financial security. David's steady presence and shared decision-making helped reinforce that not everyone would take advantage of trust or access to personal information. As we planned our honeymoon, I reflected on how different my life looked compared to what I had imagined as a college student dealing with mysterious credit report discrepancies. The young woman who had been confused and frightened by evidence of identity theft had become someone who understood financial systems, legal processes, and personal boundaries well enough to help other victims navigate similar challenges. The identity theft had stolen years of my life and caused immeasurable stress and pain, but it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed and connected me with people who valued honesty and justice. While I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, I could acknowledge that it had shaped me into someone I respected, and that it had led to relationships and opportunities that might not have existed otherwise. Most importantly, I had learned that it was possible to survive betrayal by someone you loved and trusted completely. Recovery required time, professional support, and the willingness to rebuild trust gradually with people who demonstrated their trustworthiness through consistent actions. It also required accepting that some relationships might never be repaired, while remaining open to new relationships that could provide the support and love that everyone deserved. The woman who stood before the mirror in her wedding dress was someone who understood both vulnerability and strength, who had learned to trust carefully but genuinely, and who had built a life based on her own values rather than other people's expectations or demands. The identity theft had tried to steal my future, but ultimately, it had helped me claim my authentic self. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.